You know that type of horror game where the map is clean, the ammo is not, and you're never sure if you should pull the trigger or just run? That's where Comatose lives. It's clunky in the ways we remember survival horror should be, sharp in the ways you need it to be sharp, and honestly, for well under $10, it's punching way above its weight. This is my no-spoiler review for Comatose. So, Comatose is a retro survival horror, first-person shooter from Lucky Dart, published by the Bueno Interactive, currently in early access on PC via Steam. In the story, you're exploring a decaying, looping nightmare space inside of Laura's head, managing ammo, solving puzzles, and trying to claw your way back to the real world. I completed my first single clean run on the intended normal difficulty, with no guides, no hints, just me sitting with the puzzles instead of tabbing out for a walkthrough. Honestly, I wouldn't recommend this one any other way. The game clearly wants to be that 90s survivor horror fever dream. Fixed spaces, deliberate fight-or-flight combat, and a story that plays out like a psychological, dreamlike pilot for a larger series. Minute to minute, Comatose is pure survival horror. You're creeping through narrow spaces, checking your map, deciding whether you really want to burn ammo on this thing in front of you or just bail and slam the door. The combat feels very fight or flight in a 90s way. Not smooth modern FPS gunplay, but deliberate, slightly stiff, and tuned so that the best decision is often just run. Weapons are pretty classic: shotgun, handgun, and a handful of melee options like a lead pipe or bats. Gunplay itself feels decent, but you'll notice as you go deeper the enemies start soaking more bullets than you'd probably like. It has that arc where the guns almost feel like they're losing authority the further you delve into the nightmare. Melee is technically an option, but for me it felt too risky in most situations, because of just how relentless enemies can be and how quickly things go bad at close range. Ammo and healing sit in that high tension but mostly fair pocket. You've got slow reloads and you can do some upgrading at benches. Nothing crazy, but enough to eke out a bit more survivability and damage. Mechanically, it's familiar survival horror, stuns, staggers, headshots, the usual rhythm of lining up a careful shot, watching the thing flinch and deciding whether you've bought enough time to reposition or finish it. Enemy variety is one of the places you can tell this is early access. The game could use more distinct enemy types, but it does give you a steady drip of monsters, just enough to keep you on edge and to stop you from fully relaxing into pure puzzle game mode. The balance right now is very puzzle heavy, combat light, with combat often feeling like the weaker side of the experience. But that's also why the puzzle design stands out so much. The level structure feels like someone actually sat down with the maps and made sure they were readable. You've got these clean, clear maps that update automatically as you explore, and that small feature ends up being a high quality of life boost. It's not just a straight corridor shooter, it's more of a classic survival horror loop, with backtracking, keys, shortcuts that slowly knit the world together in your head. When I say I got lost a few times, it was mostly the good kind of lost. Learning shortcuts, realizing, oh, that door loops back here, oh, there's a new shortcut that goes here. That kind of satisfying mental mapping helps somebody like me, who's very visual, but gets lost pretty easily. There are points where it tips over into scavenger hunt territory, where you're retracing half the map for a book or a coin and starting to wonder what you missed. It's not constant, but there were a couple of stretches that had that classic, I guess I'm resweeping the whole world feel. There were many standout locations, but there's a couple that deserve a mention. The bar, the cemetery both nail that eerie, dreamlike mood the game is chasing. They're not just visually distinct, they're laid out in ways that support the puzzle-first mentality, while still letting enemies cut your routes and force decisions. In terms of combat encounters, the game doesn't really escalate into huge set pieces or wild enemy mixes. Combat is, honestly, probably the weakest part of the package, and it's pretty consistent from front to back. Rather than crescendoing into something more intense, the tension and genuine, oh, that was cool moments mostly live in the puzzle design and the story beats rather than the fights. Enemies in Comatose are relentless more than they are clever. They're the kind that just keep coming, forcing you to commit to decisions under pressure instead of outsmarting some dynamic AI system. There are some pathing issues and moments where monsters get stuck, and you can use that to your advantage. Door loops, stuck enemies, that old survival horror dance. But it doesn't completely break the experience. The big spike you'll feel is in the middle of the game where enemy health suddenly jumps. You go from things taking 4 shots to feeling like they're eating 20 plus. And that's where the tension can slide into frustration if you're already low on ammo. It's a clear tuning issue and one of those spots where you can tell we're dealing with an early access balance that isn't fully dialed in yet. I played on normal, the intended difficulty, and that's what I'd recommend for most people. It feels challenging enough to keep you on edge without crossing into outright misery. And it matches the fight or flight tone the game's going for. Hard might be interesting on a replay if you're chasing more pressure, but for a first run, normal hits that sweet spot that we look for. Story-wise, Comatose is psychological and highly emotional. It leans hard into the idea that these monsters and spaces are all coming out of the main character's mind while she lies comatose. It feels very much in the lineage of early Silent Hill, monstrous imagery that's more metaphor than literal trauma and loss. In a general sense that you're walking through a nightmare, not a physical town. For Chapter 1, this lands surprisingly well. The story builds as you progress, primarily through these random phone booths you encounter. They drip feed context and deepen the sense of dream logic. Everything feels a little floaty and uncertain in a good way, like you're piercing together someone's subconscious rather than going from plot point A to point B to point C. Overall, the themes, trauma, loss, horror, feel closer to classic Silent Hill than to surface-level spooky monster dressing. It's not reinventing psychological horror, but it's playing in that space with enough sincerity and restraint that it works very well, especially as a game in early access. Visually, Comatose is absolutely going for that 90s Resident Evil and Silent Hill retro vibe. It's not a pixel-perfect PlayStation 1 remake, but it taps into that rough, slightly chunky aesthetic. Simple geometry, moody lighting, and just enough grime to make everything feel unsafe. Readability is interesting here, because the game is dark and visibility is limited, but in a way that actually helps the experience. The lighting effects do a lot of heavy lifting. They make spaces feel claustrophobic and dangerous with completely obscuring what you're looking at. There were definitely moments where I was fighting the darkness, but it felt like part of the atmosphere rather than a technical flaw. UI and inventory are mostly clean. Inventory management is really something that should be left, and I really appreciate that it was left in the past. There are a few minor annoyances, the kind of rough edges you'd expect from a small team early access project, but overall it's responsive and does what you need to do without getting in the way. Navigating your items and upgrades doesn't feel like a mini boss fight, which is more than you can say for some older game it's paying homage to. Lighting is the real star of the visual package. It punches way above its weight, selling tension, hiding threats just enough, and turning pretty simple geometry into something that feels oppressive and alive. Audio is where Comatose really shines, and it's rare I can say this about any game. It actually understands how silence and space work. Sounds bleed through walls just enough to make you second guess where they're coming from. And nothing feels loud just for the sake of being loud. The restraint does more work than a constant soundtrack ever could. When something finally cuts through the quiet, you pay attention. On the performance side, the game was mostly smooth in-game. I saw a bit of stutter when switching and using some weapons, but nothing that made it unplayable or any broke immersion. There's a film-grained setting which I mostly turned down for streaming purposes, but otherwise I didn't have to tinker heavily with options to keep things very stable. Technically, it's very solid for early access. No crashes, just occasional stuck characters, which is more than I can say for the last AAA game that I played. I did see some monsters getting stuck, but it's the kind of jank you almost expect in a retro horror throwback, and it never rose to the level of don't buy this yet. In some cases, I was actually grateful they got stuck. Progression is pretty straightforward. You get simple weapon upgrades at benches, a bit more punch here, a bit more survivability there, and some stronger items as you push further into the game. This isn't a build crafting RPG, it's more linear power growth, which is just enough decision making to feel like you're improving your odds. Only you're really not, because the monsters seem to scale at a much higher rate. What previously took 4 shots now takes 20. It's typically better to run in most cases. I think this will be fine-tuned later, but it's definitely something that I noticed. For me, the pacing across those 10 hours to the final boss was good overall. I was sad to let it go, but excited that there's more to come. There were a couple of moments where hunting specific items, one of the books, one of the coins, made it feel like I'd been forced to rewalk the entire world. But those were spikes, not the default state of the game. When I finally did find them, the sense of accomplishment was immense. My stream chat scolded me a couple of times for running past obvious items, so it probably was my fault in the end. Most of the time, you're in that nice survival horror loop of explore, puzzle, fight, breathe, repeat. Looking ahead, I'm more excited to see what the next chapter brings than I am to immediately replay chapter 1, and that's not a knock. It feels like a strong foundation, a proof of concept that says, yes, this formula works, now let's build on it. Now let's talk value, because this is where Comatose quietly flexes. At less than $10 on Steam, a 10-hour puzzle-driven survival horror experience that mostly nails its tone and audio is definitely a steal. If you're into this genre, don't wait. This isn't a wait for 75% off situation. If you like retro survival horror and puzzles, you're probably going to have a great time right now. Right now, it's PC Steam only, and I think that's fine where it needs to be right now. I don't believe you'd need a heavy rig to play it at all. Performance was mostly smooth, and the control scheme works very well. Some areas for improvement: the combat needs tuning, the enemy variety could be better, and there's some scavenger hunt item searches that seem to get in the way a little bit. But the atmosphere, puzzle design, lighting, and sound all hit that exact late 90s survival horror nerve I was hoping for. So where does that leave Comatose right now? On its first day of release and early access, I give it a strong 9 out of 10 chewy white pills. It's important to mention that right now it's sitting at $6.74 until June 18th, which, as I mentioned, it was under $10, but I think it's even more than under $10. Also, I think that's worth noting, there's a completely optional downloadable content that gives you a gold-colored gun as a way to further support the developer. It's just a few bucks, and I'd encourage you to do that if you enjoy the game. Thanks for watching. I'm a brand new channel. Please like and subscribe if you would like to see more of my upcoming videos. Thank you, and game on.